Music means we're joined by Admiral James Stavridis, United States Navy retired. Good morning, Admiral. How are you?
Doing well here in Florida, Hugh. Thank you.
I want to go back to your time as head of Southern Command of the United States military. And right now, I'm raising money for Food for the Poor because there's actually famine in Colombia and Guatemala. When the virus hits a country that has fragile infrastructure, how devastating is it compared to in the United States, Admiral? You know these countries firsthand in the Central American Isthmus, and you know Colombia. What happens?
It is terrible to see. And of course, this whole beautiful world to the south of us, roughly the size of the United States in terms of its population, a bit bigger overall. Brazil alone has 200 million people. But as it hits in a country like Colombia or, God forbid, the truly poor countries, even worse, say Haiti, for example, Venezuela, it's just devastating to watch. And people are starving. The medical care is simply not available. And parts of the country really turn into anarchy and kind of destructive impulses come out. This is really what we're seeing, Hugh, in Venezuela right now. So we ought to help. And we ought to help for two reasons. One, it's the right thing to do to try and help others if you can, particularly here in our home in the Americas. But secondly, pragmatically, it's the right thing to do for us for two reasons. One, because it reduces the flow of illegal migration to the United States. When things really fall apart in Central America, for example, it's migration that moves north toward the United States. And then secondly, it's smart because these are markets for us. Economically, we want this part of the world working economically so we can enjoy the benefits of free trade going north and south. So it's a very dark set of scenarios down south because of COVID-19, and we ought to step in and be helpful wherever we can.
Now, there is an entire hallway at the Pentagon, which I have gone down a couple of times, that is simply underscoring the relief missions that the American military, typically the Navy, runs for things like typhoons and hurricanes, and they're all named different things. When the Philippines got flattened, there was a relief, and I was kind of amazed when I walked down this hallway how often the American military does relief efforts. Do you think this is not a typhoon, this is not a hurricane, it's not an earthquake, it's not a tsunami? It's a breaking of the food chain. Is this an appropriate time for a military assistance mission?
The military certainly has a significant amount of capability that can be put against a scenario like this. And a classic example of this happened about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. I mentioned Haiti already, poorest country in the region. And they had a devastating earthquake. You'll remember that. It destroyed Port-au-Prince, the capital. And it was followed up immediately by a pandemic, if you will, a
Yep.
cholera outbreak. And so the United States responded strongly with our military. But I'll tell you the other thing we did, Hugh, was work the international effort to try and share the burden of helping and restoring what we could in Haiti. It's a bit like what's happening now in Lebanon, where you see France, appropriately in my view, taking the lead there. In Haiti, after the earthquake, the United States took the lead. And it can be tactical. It can be things like our beautiful hospital ships, Comfort and Mercy. It can be airlift. It can be troops that go down and help stabilize the situation. That's tactical. And then strategically, we can be helpful by going out, raising international funds, trying to bring business back, helping organize the Haitian diaspora here in the United States, which has a lot of capability. There's a lot the U.S. military can do that can be directly helpful. Final point here, don't forget, militaries in the end, we're all excited about the flashbang and putting bombs on targets, and we're very, very good at that. But what a military is really about is two things. It's logistics, it's moving massive quantities of stuff. And number two is it's bringing order out of chaos. Those are the two things that restore a food chain, help a nation survive a massive event like a hurricane or an earthquake. They're also the things that make a military very successful in combat operations.
Let me turn then to what you just mentioned, Admiral. The Wall Street Journal headline, Lebanon's government resigns after protest deadly
Yeah.
Beirut explosion. It notes that the current Lebanese government had formed earlier this year after the previous government dissolved late last year following mass protests. First question, I assume you've been everywhere. You've been to Lebanon a few times?
Many times. And this may sound slightly counterintuitive, but as the world is divided up between our combatant commanders, so at U.S. Southcom, I was in charge of military activity everywhere south of the United States. U.S. European Command, which I held when I was Supreme Allied Commander, includes Lebanon and Israel, by the way.
Oh,
So
that
I
is
spent
counterintuitive. Huh. Didn't know that.
it is. Yeah, and the idea is to give Israel separation from U.S. Central Command, which is so close with our Arab allies. So they want to put Israel with U.S. European Command. Just give a little separation there as part of the package, if you will. Lebanon was part of my remit in those years. So yes, I've been many times to Lebanon, and it's a country that ought to work. It's very beautiful physically. It has mountains and gorgeous ports, and it's small, about 8 million people. But it has been plagued by a lack of leadership and also plagued by division among ethnic groups in terms of Sunni, Shia, Christian, Maronite Christians, Druze. It's like the Balkans. It's got many, many different competing small entities. That's been difficult for it to overcome. That's why governments come and go with such rapidity. It's why corruption is easy. And final point here, it's why Hezbollah has settled there, because it's close to Israel. They can attack Israel from there, but it's also a weak government that they can kind of invade and find their way into. So it's a very challenging situation. And yes, I know the country well.
A lot of people have suspected Hezbollah behind this explosion, not an intentional malfeasance on their part, but the reckless disregard for the storing of explosives near explosives. And I know if you knew the real answer, you wouldn't tell me, but what do you think Beirut believes right now about that devastating video, which we've all seen, the triple explosion?
Mm. Terrible thing to watch. Here on this one, Hugh, I'm going to go with Occam's razor. You know that expression that the simplest explanation is
Yep.
so often the correct one. I think 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate, even a terrorist organization as careful in its malfeasance, if you will, as Hezbollah would know, not to just let that sit around and port, but for the exact reason of what happened here. This is, in my view, garden variety negligence. The government ought to be held accountable. There ought to be a big criminal investigation. I think all those things are going to happen. And as a result, maybe this will be a kind of wake-up call for the people of Lebanon. There's going to be a lot of turbulence coming out of the back end of this thing.
I remember during the Cedar Revolution, when the Syrians were forced out, everyone thought a new day was dawning in Lebanon. In fact, it hadn't been it hadn't been as bad as the Civil War, which raged for 10 years, but compared to when you were in charge of the European Command and today, has it gone precipitously downhill, or is it just muddling through disaster after disaster?
I think the latter, with a definite downward spiral, and I'll add to it that part of the cedar revolution. You're right to raise that. Cedar, of course, is one of the trees that grows along the Mediterranean there. This was in 2005, I think, and there was a sense coming out of it that some of the underlying inequality that plagues the Arab world would be addressed. That's what has not happened. So there continues to be immense inequality and the corruption that goes along with that. Again, it's a country that ought to work. The people are well educated. They're clever. They're very, very smart in the world of business. They just are plagued by the divisions in the society that they have never really been able to overcome.
There is the old cliche, the Paris of the Middle East, when Beirut was the seaside
Yeah.
resort of choice. The question is, can they ever stabilize with Hezbollah, which has been grafted on? It's not an alien force because Shias have been in Lebanon for as long as Sunni and Christians. Well, not as long as Christians; they were there first, but it's been a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state for a long time. But Hezbollah is a revolutionary movement. Is that the main problem?
I think it is one of the two main problems. One is Hezbollah, which is taking advantage of the disagreements between the groups that we mentioned a moment ago. It's somewhat comparable in Iraq, which has Sunni, Shia, and Kurds. Picture Iraq if the Islamic State had taken over there and grafted itself somehow into that society and took advantage of it. I think Iraq ultimately is going to work its way through and become an example of a multi-ethnic state that works reasonably well. We'll see. In Lebanon with Hezbollah, it's like a cancer eating at the inside of the country. It's an extra governmental power in a
It's a
society.
terrorist power. Yeah, it's a terrorist.
It is. The closest you could perhaps come to it here would be during Prohibition, when you saw the big gangs being able to really move things, or maybe in New York City at times with the mafia as a second power source where people could go for justice and solve things. Think Don Corleone and The Godfather. That is bad for a society, to say the least. And I think that's what's plaguing Lebanon.
Admiral James Stavridis, always a pleasure. Follow him on Twitter, Stavridis J. Stavridis J. There's no U in there. It's Stavridis J. If you're keeping up with the Admiral, you're keeping up with the world. As I said,